Recording from our respective offices, I'm Matthew Huffman, Public Affairs Director at MCA-DSV, and this is Momentum, a webcast produced by your coalition, connecting advocates across our state. 2020 is the year of MCA-DSV's 40th anniversary, and all year we're working on a storytelling project to capture and memorialize memories from advocates at member agencies about what it means to them to be part of the coalition. I am excited and honored to introduce my guest this month. She is the retiring executive director of Lafayette House in Joplin, a founding board member of MCA-DV, and, in the words of our operations director, Zach, an individual whose service to Missouri leaves a big footprint for the rest of us. It is my honor to introduce Alison Malinowski Sunday. Alison, welcome to the webcast.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I am very excited to have you joining me on the webcast this month. Like I had mentioned in the intro, it is our 40th anniversary, and so I'm excited to be able to chat with you about your experience of working with the coalition. But I'm also really excited to interview you on your last official week in your role. So I feel like there's just a wealth of stories for you to share with us.
Well, we'll see.
So to get us started, I feel like we need to just kind of start out at the very beginning. How did you get started in the domestic and sexual violence movement?
Yes, so I graduated from the University of Maryland in College Park in 1980. And as part of my undergraduate degree, I was required to do a 6-month practicum. And I actually, my degree was in social science, but I had participated in so many women's studies, quotes are there, classes that my advisor had suggested that I add a minor, which was a women's studies certificate. So really, even in college, my interests were very much of working with women in society. And so when I needed a practicum, I kind of looked around and discovered that Washington, D.C., which has one of the largest homeless populations in the country, and did, even in 1980, only had one shelter providing overnight shelter for women who were experiencing homelessness. So that was the House of Ruse, and I approached them. They did not do practicums at the time, but I sort of convinced them that they would surely want to do that. So when I began working there, it was really clear that so many of the women seeking shelter at the House of Ruse were homeless because of domestic violence. They showed up with their children. They literally walked out of their homes and had no place safe to go, and so sought shelter with the shelter. So that was, we didn't even have terminology about interpersonal violence in our relationships at the time. And so that really got me kind of just reading and studying. There was a book that came out by Del Martin called Battered Wives, and that really just kind of got me started on this long career.
Yeah, you know, mentioning that, it made me think about just what you said, that there wasn't really the terminology around intimate partner violence at the time. And so as you began your practicum there, and you know, I think the start of you being a trailblazer, considering the fact they'd never had practicum students before. Were other people on staff there seeing this dynamic and how it was playing out?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, you know, really, all of the people there were social workers, essentially. We had one woman who was a nun by identity, but certainly a social worker by profession, the director of the shelter. So really, it was a group of women who were social workers providing homeless services. But really, we all were paying attention and talking with the women coming in and trying to help them figure out where they were going next. And so the theme was quite apparent.
Mhm.
The House of Ruth actually went on to create a separate program specifically addressing adult domestic violence, and that still exists today. So, that was just so early on in the field. So anyway, I graduated and decided that I wanted adventure and I wanted to get off the East Coast. So I decided to join VISTA, which at the time was a national program, and you signed up with your experiences and then they placed you somewhere. And VISTA placed me in Joplin, Missouri to do community development for this just created organization called the Family Self-Help Center. And here I am, many
Well,
years later.
yeah, and still there doing community development work many years later.
That's
And,
right.
you know, hearing you say you were looking for adventure and wanting to get away from the East Coast, did you imagine that it would take you to Joplin, Missouri? Joplin's
No.
pretty far from Maryland, so of all the places Vista could have taken you.
Quite the country. Back then, you actually could pick the part of the country that you wanted to go to. And I had always a lot of interest in working with indigenous people, and the plight of Native American women is and was then and is still today really quite intense. And I had really hoped to go to the Four Corners out further west and work with indigenous women, but that was not to be. And they sent me to Joplin, and I said, oh, okay, I'll go. That's where they need me, I'll go there. It's only a year, I explained to my mother, who was quite horrified. Well, it's only a year, Mom. I'll be back.
And only a year ended up keeping you there for much longer than that.
Yes. 40 years later.
Well, thinking about that a little more, and at your tenure at Lafayette House, you've really run the gamut of job responsibilities there. So, Vista staff member to executive director and everything in between. I'm curious, in your 40 years there, how you've really seen services have to adapt and change to the needs of survivors and their families.
Yeah, it's again, it's so hard to paint that picture, because in fact, Matthew, we had no idea what we were doing in 1980. There was no blueprint for this. So it's not like we had coalitions that write standards and policies and practices and provided that for us. We were literally making it up as we went along. So when I got to Joplin, the organization was actually founded by 3 women who had recent personal experience with partner violence and homelessness as a result of that. And this was 1980, so we were still trying to get the original ERA passed. So women were doing a lot of connecting around the ERA, and Joplin has a college. And so there were a group of women professors who were really working hard on the community to help get Missouri to pass the ERA. And this group of women who were working to create a safe place for other women experiencing violence connected with this group of women trying to pass the ERA. And as they traveled to Jeff City together, there was just a lot of storytelling and a lot of sharing about what brought each woman to that car to try and get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. So those college professors were sort of inspired to help the women who had personal experience with violence. And that's how our organization was founded, really, was that those two dynamic groups pairing up and talking about, frankly, very shared experiences, although economically very different experiences. So that's how we were founded. And
Yeah.
we started just as being a safe place, so that if you needed to leave your home in the middle of the night, there was some place to go and that you could be safe with your children. There were no fancy services. It was really, every day trying to figure out how to find toilet paper and food to cook. So really the development of services came, well, it seemed like much later. Of course, time went by. We developed services, we developed things so quickly, really months, that we had hired a social worker and began to provide advocacy and engaged the police department in helping us. So, it seemed like it took us a long time, but really we started adding services pretty quickly.
I really appreciate you talking about how Lafayette House was founded, and what a great way of really talking about community development and organizing, where you had the professors at the college really trying to organize around getting the Equal Rights Amendment passed in Missouri, and at the same time, a group of women who saw this huge need in their community to help women and their families leave an abusive situation, their abusive partner, and find safety. And I'm trying to just think about what that car ride must have been like from Joplin to Jefferson City, and having that shared experience and sharing those stories with one another.
Yeah, well, there were many car rides. We tried for a very long time to get that ERA passed. Yeah, and it was the car rides taught us about our shared realities. So they may have seemed different when the conversation started, but the similarities and the connections quickly became apparent. And I think that is so much a part of the whole domestic violence movement, that and certainly has always been a core for me about how services need to be structured so that women can share those stories. Because even if the external details appear different, in fact, the stories are very similar, and one woman is helping another woman understand maybe a different approach, or how one person solves a problem really does help everybody else in the room think about new ways that maybe they could approach something. And to me, that's been always the key to the services, is to provide a safe place for people to connect and communicate, and not just, it's not a doctor's office where someone with a problem comes in and some expert solves that problem. Our job as a staff is to create safety for people with shared experiences to communicate with one another. And as we know with domestic violence, believing a victim is absolutely the place to start. I mean, there's your baseline. And so people who believe one another and hear one another and can talk about, how did you get where you are and where are you going, helps me figure out how I got here and where I'm going.
I love the way that you talk about that with just creating the opportunity to have a safe place to connect and share stories and learn with and from each other. I think that is such a really important aspect of this work, right? Is being able to have that shared connection. And I think that you have
everything.
Yeah, it really is. It's just every single part of the work, you're right. Mm-hmm. And I think you have such a really unique perspective on it too, because Lafayette House provides services for domestic violence, sexual assault, and substance use and abuse. And oftentimes in our work, we talk about how survivors of trauma, we're only allowed to see certain pieces of their life. Yet we know that they're dealing with a variety of things that have happened in the past that got them to where they are. And it's also their strength and ingenuity that got them to where they are.
Right.
So you being able to see that on all of these different interconnections, I think is just a really important piece of thinking about the work in general and providing that space for connection.
Right. And I think that the important piece for me, so like in 1980, it was no different than it is today. And that is, you listen to what the person walking in the door is saying. And that tells you the services that you should be offering. So as I said, in 1980, there was no handy dandy manual that says provide individual counseling. And this is what that should look like, and provide crisis intervention and provide advocacy. And that's what this is. We just had to listen to what the person walking in the door said they needed. And then you figured out how that happened. And maybe you didn't even name it advocacy for 3 years until some grant helped name it for you, but that's what you did. So I don't think it's any different today. Services have to change. They have to develop based on the needs of the people walking in the door. And so all the staff, and I always, the most important staff in the center are the people closest to the people you serve, because they have to really drive what does the service delivery look like? What has to look like what the people walking in your door need? And that will change as our clients have changed.
And to your point, I think that listening is such an important skill that was as important as it was in 1980, is still just as important in 2020, and will be just as important 40 years from now.
Absolutely.
So really deeply listening and engaging with people.
Right.
So Alison, you have also been involved in a lot of statewide advocacy. And as I had mentioned in the introduction, you're a founding board member of MCADV. So whenever it was the sole domestic violence coalition before we went dual. And you're also the only board member to have ever written a grant for the coalition. So I say this in two ways: as a big C coalition of the 124 member agencies across Missouri, and a little C coalition of our staff working at the coalition on behalf of all our member agencies. We owe a debt of gratitude to you for that. And I'm curious if you can kind of talk about, what it was like in those early days of founding the coalition.
Yeah, really the coalition came about because we were spread out so far across the state. So there were about 5 programs: St. Louis, Kansas City, Columbia, Joplin. I'm trying to think if we had anything in the Southeast in those super early days. So we were really widely dispersed, and we needed the support from one another. We needed a place to process and to, and of course, we all believed in political action. I already talked about the ERA. We did believe that political action was important for addressing domestic violence. So there's the personal side of domestic violence and what happens to the individuals who are directly affected by it. But there is also a political part of domestic violence. And for that, we wanted to create the coalition. So the coalition was founded really partly and maybe primarily as a support system for us, so that we had a group of people who understood what we were dealing with, who could come together regularly, monthly or quarterly, and then to work together to look at laws and political remedies around the issues. I think we really believed that changing the legal dialogue around interpersonal violence in relationships was fundamental to really help families for the long haul. We had to have that happen. So that's how it happened. And Columbia was really the initial birthplace of the coalition. We met in a basement of a church in Columbia for probably a year and a half before we had the wherewithal to hire Colleen and get a Jeff City. I think we probably just, I think that first location was maybe even no rent in Jeff City. I mean, we had no money, so well, we were frugal women.
Yeah, I know Colleen has shared the story about the first official office of the coalition being a kind of apartment that was attached to RACS, the domestic violence shelter in Jefferson City.
Right.
And that the office space wasn't safe enough to actually house families because there were some leaking and roof issues. But, you work with what you have, just like you said, you are resourceful. So that was the best office space at the time. You work with what you have.
Gee, this is not safe, so let's put you there.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate how you describe that too, because it makes me think about how the personal is political. So
absolutely.
Just how very personal it was for all of you in the beginning to create a space and an organization to support one another in work that we know is rewarding, but also incredibly difficult. And at the same time, recognizing political action is absolutely necessary to push this work forward and to change the laws and the dynamics and the dialogue around it.
Right. Right. And even creating language so that you can talk about it. I mean, that's part of what happens when you bring advocates together, where you start sharing, okay, what are the common themes here? And what do we call that? And how do we address that? I mean, that coming together helps create the, the language and the ability, the political realities. How do we, part of many a spirited lunch conversation was, what were the political actions that we needed to take? How did we create a crime of violence against your wife? I mean, that was not even a crime at the time. So it took a lot of just talking it through, okay, what do we do next? And then we'd all go back to our communities and talk to others and do it again. So anyway, it was an excellent time. The coalition, that was maybe one of the smartest things we did as a group in this state. The women, and I say women because we were all women from all these different corners in the state, recognizing that we needed each other and that together we were stronger and more powerful. And frankly, we could solve problems better if we did it as a group. So, and part of that took money, and we didn't have money. So you had mentioned the grant that I helped write. That was just a reality, is that each of our programs were surviving literally on shoestrings. And so in the planning, in the conceptual stage, it made sense that the coalition would be funded by its members, so that each member agency would have a vested interest in the coalition being successful. So we would come up with the money, and that would fully vest us in the coalition. But the reality is we didn't have enough money individually to really fund a staff position. And I don't know what Colleen's initial salary was, but let me tell you, it wasn't much. And even that little bit was just beyond us all. So that's why the grant was written, was to find a way to fund and to move forward.
So I want to talk a little bit about our CEO, Colleen. The two of you have had the great opportunity to work alongside each other through the years. And she gave me permission to ask about this story. But you were on the hiring committee that passed on her originally when she applied for the job. So can you tell us a little bit about that backstory?
I simply do not remember that. I read that in your minutes to me. I can remember so much about hiring Colleen. I can remember where we did the interviews, and I can remember her walking in the room because she's quite stunning, and she was then as well. I think she probably had great shoes on. I would guess that. That is it. I simply don't remember that we did not hire her immediately. And frankly, it stuns me we didn't hire her immediately. So she'll have to ask others who maybe have a better memory.
Well, I know that in stories that she has shared with me, it was a comment from someone else on the hiring committee that maybe she shouldn't have worn fishnet stockings to the interview. And you were very kind and gracious to say, some people didn't quite like that approach of yours. So next time around, maybe leave the fishnets at home, but you did a fantastic job. Otherwise, it's yours.
There you go.
Yes. Well, I think it's just such a really great story of you talking about how the coalition was formed and just how you said seeing the need to really have member agencies become invested in it, and I think that's such a really important aspect as we look at it now, that our coalition is only as strong as we are because of those founding members and because of the support of the 124 member agencies we still have.
Right.
And so that is such a really important piece of our history to just remember.
Yeah, and it's hard for me because when the coalition decided to expand its membership to non-member, to individuals or organizations that weren't direct service providers, I fought that that motion, and I've thought about that a lot. Why did I had a real visceral negative reaction by that. But I think that really does go back to the 1980s, when it was so important for us to be allies for one another, and that the coalition was the pillar of that. And I really worried that we would dilute that. There are times, and I'm perfectly comfortable with conflict, and I think that there are times when it's really helpful for people with shared goals, as in the coalition, to have conflict and to be able to kind of hash an issue out from all sides without feeling like there are others who might take things the wrong way or whatever. So I think that was probably, really, really emotional for me. I think Colleen and I maybe chatted on the telephone after a conference call because she could tell that I was not happy with this direction. And, I don't think I was able to verbalize it at the time. That I think that I always worry that it is essential that program providers have that safe place to disagree and to have different opinions and to safely argue that out. And I hope that the coalition will always maintain that safe place.
I hope so too. And I said that with a bit of a pause, only because I'm curious if you see our work of uniting Missourians to end rape and abuse, if you see that work evolving anywhere in the future. And so I know that you've been able to be so foundational in this work over the last 40 years. Are there any kind of projections of where you think this work is going to go?
I worry a little bit about it because to me, it is plenty that be our mission. And there are a lot of allied, connected, associated issues, problems, concerns. Child abuse being the most clearly connected. But I don't want to lose the heart of the domestic violence. So to me, domestic and sexual violence is one thing. I mean, it is one does not talk to someone who has experienced domestic violence without hearing about sexual violence as well. I mean, it's just, it is a shared issue. And it's an important issue. And we are nowhere near solving the issues. And I would not like to see the movement veer away from that important focus. There is so much. There are so many justice issues out there, and we are partners with many allied groups. But I think being partners and collaborating and supporting one another is different than merging into a single movement. And I think if we try to merge into a single movement, then we water down our message. And I would not like to see that happen, or we lose our focus. Sometimes I worry a little bit about us being a little over professional now. I know I talk to people who work within programs who've not talked to anybody who is experiencing this problem. I think that's a loss. I think that people making decisions, the coalition has, kind of a best practice about people having personal experience with the issues, being on their board. That is not a nice idea as a best practice. That is vital to this movement, that we have got to have people with personal experience in these issues, making sure that our programs are really focused on those issues and solving those issues. So I feel like staff at Lafayette House, we have always respected lived experience. And we have staff who readily share their lived experience with one another and with me on a regular basis about practices. And that's important, that programs have got to stay really rooted. So anyway, you asked about future. Those are pieces of the past that I hope we don't lose in the future, that to me really are what have, this movement has been unbelievably successful. If one is a studier of the history of social movements, in my lifetime, we have created a movement and defined a movement and created a language and created best practices in my lifetime around this issue. Well, that's ridiculously short amount of time. And I'm very proud of that. I mean, I think that's, I think that those of us involved in this movement should all take pride in that, because we have made great strides. I guess I had hoped that when I retired, that I would retire by saying, gee, domestic violence isn't really that big of an issue in Joplin anymore, and I can now go off and do something else. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime or my granddaughter's lifetime. But I do think that we've created a very solid foundation, and a living foundation. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the field needs to stand still. It doesn't. but there are some pieces that need to come forward with it. So as we do incorporate professionals and the law and other issues and trauma-informed care, all of those pieces are important, but let's keep a context of really understanding the dynamics of interpersonal violence in relationships as the core for us. Well, that was a long answer, Matthew.
It was, but it was a great answer, Allison. I appreciate you really digging into the question that I asked too. And you know what I kind of took from what you said, and a couple of things that I just want to lift up out of that, is that one, it goes back to exactly what you and I were talking about earlier with the importance of listening, continuing to listen and learn from one another. And I think it also just really highlights how important it is that we stay connected to our history as we move forward and as this work continues. And I love that you said keeping a living foundation of the work and what that means, and really seeing what the work has been rooted in and what will grow out of that.
Right.
Yeah, so yes, it was a long answer, but such a great, thoughtful answer. Well, I do want to ask about something else that Joplin is rather famous for. So, taking us back to May 2011, it was a Sunday evening when an EF5 tornado that was nearly a mile wide struck the city of Joplin. And so I'm curious to hear from you what it was like in the aftermath of that tornado. So for you and for the other staff working there.
Yeah, sort of like nothing, I don't know that there's even words for what it was like. I'm not a multi-color person. You know, a lot of people talk in colors, and yet that is a predominant memory. Part of my memory there is it was such a dark time. So the immediate post-storm, 2 weeks, probably 2 weeks, Joplin looked like we were the end result of some horrible war. Literally, our school, our high school, had the inside of the school hanging out the windows like it had imploded. You know, it was just shocking visually. And almost everybody was walking around a little shell-shocked, and everyone had, everybody had great fatigue and sadness, horror. You could not find your way around town because every bit of your reference points were gone. Normally you turn at the Kentucky Fried Chicken to go up the street 8 blocks, and then you hang a right at that tree with the big limbs hanging over the road. Gone. That wasn't a single one of them. That they literally had to come paint the name of our streets on the surface of the streets to help people be oriented because there were no reference points. So that was a very shocking time and a very difficult time. Quickly, though, we saw great resilience in our community. The interesting thing is we had quite the lull with domestic violence. The people who were with us stayed with us because there now was no place to go. Our shelter, we contacted all the people who were being served as outpatients to make sure they had safe places. And some did not and came in to us. We made sure all our staff had a safe place to be. And if not, we would have brought them in to live with us. But some early on the staff came in, but most were out. We really didn't have any staff here after a week. Domestic violence calls were super quiet initially. Unfortunately, our sexual assault numbers really went through the roof almost immediately. And that's because people were so displaced. So, the calls of, well, I was sleeping on the couch of the neighbor of my brother. And, I didn't even know these people's names, and then they were sexual assault victims. So we had a lot of sexual violence. But domestic violence was calm for about 6 weeks. Then very busy.
Yeah, which I appreciate you kind of talking about how you saw services kind of occurring in patterns immediately following. I think that that's something we often see in natural disasters. And just as you said, when people are displaced, when there is additional layers of stress and trauma occurring, you don't always see the immediate spike in domestic violence, but you do see a spike in sexual violence, and just really looking at those kind of underlying factors there. 9 years later, we are in the midst of another natural disaster with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm wondering if you can draw any comparisons between the 2011 tornado and what your community is currently experiencing.
Immediately, and I can really just talk mostly about myself. So my own trauma, the immediate piece for both events seemed very similar. So I'm sitting at home with my emails flooding me. So that happened in the tornado, that happened with this, where literally I could not get out of my email without more coming at me, and things to read, things to do, things to respond to, people needing this or that, or telling me something. And I think I spent a good month like that after the tornado, and the same with the COVID, where you just have the nonstop. I will tell you that the COVID-19 was worse, because the tornado, the event was a moment in time. Boom, it happened. And you're either a survivor or you're not a survivor. The COVID, of course, there was no end in sight. We did not know what was coming. So everything was very, has been a constant learning curve. What's around the corner? So I have, at this moment in time, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic, I said at my retirement party last week, this has been the hardest 6 months of my 40 years because of that, because of the not knowing. The tornado, it was, and then we were recovering. We were working to put pieces back together, but it was done. This is not done. And we don't even know when it will be done. We don't know, have we hit bottom yet? 6 months in, we're still asking, what is the worst point? Where is that, the bottom of the well? We don't know that yet. And that's very difficult for at least someone in my position, because I'm a bit of a control freak and I want to know what I can get through anything if I know what it is and how long is it. But boy, this big question mark of and of course it's so interesting that we're talking right now because Joplin is absolutely blowing up with the COVID-19 cases this last 2 weeks. We were listed number one of the hotspots in the nation. So, that's a very real concern right now for us is where is bottom?
Yeah. Well, I think that you have so accurately identified the feeling that so many folks at other agencies around the state are feeling right now too, with the unknowns.
Right.
Not knowing the full extent of what was coming, not knowing the full extent of how individual communities are impacted, not knowing when an end is in sight or what that end even looks like.
Right.
And so I appreciate you really drawing that comparison for us between, in the tornado, it was one event and then it was over. But with this pandemic, we still just don't know what we don't know.
Right.
And really kind of giving voice to those unknowns and just how difficult it is for folks.
Yeah, it is. And, on so many different levels. So you've got your own operating. So, I know I'm worried every day about my staff's health and safety. So that's always number one, is to make sure that you're operating as safely as possible for everybody while continuing to provide services. But then there's the health of the community. Will my community have the money to continue to operate an ambulance service? Gee, I don't know. Will the state have the revenue to continue the domestic violence grants that they have provided? We don't know that yet. As the pandemic continues, the resources that flow from it that stop as a result of it. I don't know about other shelters, but we get a lot of money from the municipal court fees. Well, how many tickets do you think our local police officers are writing right now? That would be like none. We don't even have municipal court happening in all of Southwest Missouri. So that's a revenue that just poof, disappeared. That's a revenue that I always counted as one of my basements. It's not a lot of money, but I can always count on it's going to be there. Not so true anymore. So it's very challenging times. And it could not be a better time for me to retire, I will tell you.
Well,
I am ready to pass that torch.
And it is a torch you have held for 40 years, so a well-deserved retirement. And sticking with that a little bit more, I'm kind of curious, now that you are getting ready to retire and pass this torch on, what do you want your legacy to be?
Number one, that Joplin has a strong and stable retreat available for victims of domestic violence. So that Lafayette House stays as a very reliable, accessible organization. We have great staff with a lot of longevity. I have a lot of staff on board with 25 years or more of experience with us. So my number one legacy, I'm hoping, will be that Lafayette House is a very steady, solid organization. We have a good community reputation. We have a lot of community support, and that's what I want carried into the future.
So sticking true with your roots of community development.
Right.
And coming full circle there.
That's right. See, those bachelor's degrees really do stick with us a very long time, Matthew.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thinking about that too, I'm curious if you have advice for this next generation of advocates who are graduating, they're entering their first jobs in this field, they're new to the movement. What advice would you give to them?
Well, number one is just embrace it. I mean, nobody really sticks around in this field if sorry. So I guess my number one is to love what you do. It's important, and find a way to really feed your soul while you do this, but it is important work. And if you want to stay with it, there's so many opportunities. I mean, you can go lots of different directions. If you sit still in this field, I think it's very hard to really stay active for a long period of time, because it can be kind of soul crushing. But you can move within the field and stay very engaged if that's what you want to do. I recently had another executive director in the community come and talk to me. They had received a terrific job offer for a lot of money, and they wanted my advice. And of course I laughed and said, well, you're asking totally the wrong person. You're asking the woman who's never left her job. And she said, well, I want to know, why haven't you left your job? And I said, well, because I care about the mission. The work is what's important here. And she said, wow, okay, yeah. So she ended up staying at her job as well, because she hadn't really thought about the reason that she was in the job is because she really cared about what her not-for-profit does. So if you're an advocate in the field today and you really care about what you're doing, feed yourself by going back to school, getting different skills, whatever, but you can stay in the movement and you can stay engaged in this because there's a need for so many of us doing different things in the field that you can help don't take us to the next level, take the next direction. So, and I hope the coalition stays strong and stays committed to the mission, because we need you too.
Well, Alison, I really appreciate you saying that. And I know that this conversation has certainly fed my soul with you sharing your wisdom and your stories from over the years. So I appreciate you being on the webcast with me today and really sharing that.
Thank you, Matthew. It's been delightful.
Oh, good. I'm really glad to hear that. And I really appreciate you being on here. And I also know that it's your final week and you're a very popular person, so I don't want to keep you from other calls that you have coming in today. But I'm so glad that we had this opportunity. Thank you for being on the webcast with us.
Thanks, Matthew, and best of luck to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Thank you, Alison.
Bye.